All right, everybody, we're going to get started. My name is Jonathan Lane. I'm current president of AGM, and I want to thank the Outreach Committee for their work on this Lunch and Learn. Marcy, Jessica from Bethel, Joseph from Providence, Kent from Capital, and especially Andy Rankins, who this would not have happened without her hard work. Thank Capital for letting us use their room and their venue for this. And thank you to Gateway, I assume is on the video call, for their sponsorship for this Lunch and Learn. And if you have not signed up for our emails, go to administratorsofgospelmusic.com/contact, sign up, you get all of our information, updates, whatnot, especially about the upcoming conference in October. I'm going to pass this off to Andy to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I want to introduce our wonderful, esteemed guest, Mr. Brock Shinen. If I could sum Brock up in a few words, I would say he's an experienced and passionate attorney with a very strong educational gift. His gifts are apparent in how he works with his clients and the public through his work on www.canyoucopyrightatweet.com. It's actually a very interesting read. You guys should all check it out. And his recently launched training course for the worship community at worshipindustry.com. And with all that, I'm very excited to say this is a topic that's very relevant to everyone in this room and who's online virtually. Welcome to all of our virtual guests. Thank you for being here. This is being recorded, so if you miss something, you'll be able to go back and get access to it. And even for those in attendance, we'll send it out to you guys as well. And Brock, I'm going to make you the presenter, and I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great. Perfect.
Well, thanks you guys so much. It's an honor to participate. Sorry, just got the screen notifications. Just click out of that. Honor to participate, an honor to spend time. AGM has been a big piece of my career, a big piece of, I'll kind of tell you a little bit about my story briefly, but I know we don't have a ton of time. And I feel like this is, it's an interesting topic. It's a somewhat complicated topic. I think, you know, I don't want to get beat up afterwards because I'm sure I'm going to say some things and point some things out that may make some people uncomfortable. But I really feel it's important that we have to address this topic kind of head on because it's somewhat new. I'll explain why I even think that, but we're just dealing with a little bit of a mess, a little bit of a new frontier. So I'm going to jump in. My background, and I appreciated Andy, the introduction. I'm a lawyer, but I kind of got my start. My mom was a worship leader. My grandparents had a traveling quartet ministry. So I grew up in the church and I grew up around worship. I grew up around music, and it's always been a significant piece of me. And professionally, I got my start. I think many of you, or some of you I know that I got my professional start at Vineyard Music back in the 90s when I was the director of publishing there. So it's pretty significant, impactful time for me. I gained a lot of experience, but fast forward now as an attorney, a strategy consultant, I work with worship movements all over the country, artists, songwriters, producers, the whole bit. Interacting with copyright and music and entertainment in general, writing and talking on it, all that sort of thing. So enough about me. Let's jump in. Now, because in preparation for this, because I would assume that this group has more experience, more exposure to the topic than the average layperson, I don't want to do a sort of 101, but having said that, I've worked with people that have been in the business for 30 years and through the course of conversation realize, well, they're taking something for granted that they probably learned 30 years ago and have just kind of adapted that thought to today without really changing it. So I do want to cover what I might call some baseline 101 things, and we'll jump into that too. And I try my best to kind of explain myself on what I mean in every step of the way. So first thing is, I don't think we can talk about samples and medleys and mashups and all that without getting a baseline for the perspectives and the biases that come into it, right? Because depending on who you are in the room, if you're an administrator, if you're a publisher, you have one angle. And I don't mean to say narrowly you can't see other angles, but you certainly come into this conversation with one angle. But if you think about it from a creator's perspective, just to cut to the chase, a creator is not necessarily thinking about the rules, right? They're not necessarily thinking about, well, how does copyright play into my decision whether I use somebody else's material? So that perspective has a pretty significant role in what the creator does in contrast to what an owner may do. Contrast both of those to what a lawyer may do or what the law may say about the situation. So you have these competing biases, these competing interests that come into play when we're talking about medleys and sampling and licensing and mashups and all that, where if I'm an owner or publisher, administrator, I might think, well, this is the way it's supposed to be done. But if I'm a creator, I don't care what you think, right? I think I just want to create. I don't want to be bound by your rules. And we see this with music and technology all the time. We see this, you know, even I want to be really, as a side note, I want to be really cautious about calling out any names or brands just because we're a small community. We love each other. We're here to help each other. So I'm going to try my best to not, you know, point at any, but there's a distribution platform out there that we're all aware of, a streaming platform that's challenging some significant, I think you probably know where I'm going with this. Where does that leave the creator? Where does that leave the consumer? Because another bias that comes into play when we're talking about samples and medleys, does the consumer care about any of this at all? No. So the creators and the owners may be fighting where the consumer is, just give me music. Do we care what your problem is? Do we care who's getting paid what? For the most part, I'll tell you, most consumers could care less about our problems. So we need to be mindful of the fact that as we're navigating this topic, consumers are out there just waiting to ingest our content. They're waiting to listen to our music. And we want to set rules. We want to set parameters, but the consumer doesn't always care. So factor that in. From there, I want to jump to just what I would call sort of baseline definitions. And when we talk about definitions, you know, sampling, medleys, mashups, all that, the reason why I think this is important and simultaneously completely irrelevant is because we're in a day and age where I think negotiations are going to play a much more significant role than how we define something. So our mindset, how we view this topic, how we negotiate is going to make all the difference, where whether we call it an interpolation or a mashup or whatever isn't necessarily going to make or break the deal. It may help us kind of come up with standards. It may help us kind of come up with talking points when we're having these kind of conversations. But at the end of the day, really what happens with these definitions is they're nothing more than context to help us, you know, walk through this conversation. So with that, let's just kind of knock out a few where I feel like we kind of need to be on the same page. And I went through, you know, of course, as an attorney, I have my idea what definitions I should use, but then I kind of went online and just what are people using? So I'm going to grossly summarize and paraphrase some definitions just so we can kind of get all on the same page. Samples. Let's start with samples. Historically, I think most of you would agree, samples has always sort of been with respect to a sound recording. Now, I can say in all the years I've been doing this, and in all the years I've been involved in music, which is decades, this may sound weird, but for the first time, just in the last 60 days or maybe 90 days, I heard somebody using the word sampling with respect to musical composition. Now, some of you may say, oh yeah, well, you know, we just have to distinguish. For me, I never run into that. So sampling has always meant sound recording. And what is a sample? It's basically taking a piece of a sound recording, somebody else's typically, incorporating it to yours. I'm not a history or a music history major, but my understanding is that sampling kind of originated with, you know, the hip hop genres, maybe funk or soul or pieces like that. But what you would do is to take a piece of another sound recording, incorporate it into your own. That's what we're talking about when we say sampling. So I'm going to circle back to all this, but I just want to kind of lay out some definitions. The next one is medley, or actually, let's talk about covers real quick. And I know this is probably like, Brock, you're talking about covers in this context. I think by the end of the time that we're talking, you realize why, because this is more complicated than we actually realize it is, even though we already know it's complicated. So what is a cover? Well, historically, a cover is, I want to use your song, your musical composition, I want to record it, so I'm going to cover it, right? But where do we get the rules for covering? I mean, when we think about it, where do some of the rules come into play, how we know what constitutes a cover or something else? Part of that is we look at the language of the compulsory license, right? We say, well, a compulsory license says you can record this song if you don't change the fundamental character of the original, right? So we've tend to just taken in that when we do a cover, it's got to sound like the original, or maybe it's not a cover, maybe it's something else, it's a derivative work, it's something like that. But think about this, in all of your years of experience, where do you draw the line between what's a cover and what's not? I mean, I think we mostly take that for granted. We say, well, if it pretty much sounds like the original, it's a cover. John Mark McMillan, one of my clients, you guys know, and when Kim Walker from Jesus Culture did How He Loves, she did Sloppy Wet Kiss, and as a lyric. A lot of people flipped out about that, right? And so a lot of people started using Warm Hug, or what, I don't know what they used, but they used another line for that, right? So think about that. Is that a cover? I mean, I think every single person in the room would say, yeah, that's a cover. Why? There was a lyric changed. Well, because it wasn't substantial, right? It was minimal. It didn't change the fundamental nature of the original. So we still call it a cover. But we're going to get into where that line starts to get stretched into maybe something else other than a cover. So, okay, we know what a cover is. Okay, let's talk medley. Now, I sent, I think some of you, or maybe all of you, would have received a couple of links, just about, I think, 3 or 4 links, where I wanted you to just have a context for this conversation. But if you didn't get the links, no problem, get them later. But how many of you watched the Billboard Music Awards a couple of weeks ago? A lot of you, some of you? So maybe, I don't know, it looked like a quarter of the room. Kelly Clarkson did a song that turned into another song, that turned into another song, that turned into another song, which we would professionally say, that's a medley, right? So how do we define a medley? Historically, medleys were, we start with an original, turns into the next. It kind of overlaps, it overflows into the next. It's not always full, complete songs, but we tend to perceive a medley as a succession of the melody line, or the succession of songs, right? If you haven't taken a chance to look at that Kelly Clarkson video, or if you don't know the link, you can always jump on YouTube, just search Kelly Clarkson Billboard Music Award medley, and pop, there it is. So it'll give you a really good sense of what a medley is. Let's go to a mashup. Now, mashup, I think, is where we kind of get into some of the newer topics, right? And the interesting thing for me, if you look back in history, technology didn't really allow, certainly not consumers, and consumer creators didn't have the tools to create anything maybe beyond a medley, because it was too expensive. I mean, even with record labels, what they're able to create, we had limitations, we had financial limitations, technological. Today, pretty much anything is available. So let's talk about, mashups. With a mashup, you're blending different songs. A mashup, sometimes you have an instrumental track and you're putting a different vocal track over it. Sometimes it's original, sometimes it's actually a sample. It just depends, but a mashup is basically, from my perspective, taking bits and pieces of different tracks and laying them over each other. Again, very common in the hip hop genre. So let's use that as kind of our working definition. Interpolations. This is where, instead of sampling, you're re-recording a piece from another song. So you're actually still interpolating. And some of you, this is why I say, some people in the room will say, Brock, you're not being very specific. And as we go, I'm gonna explain why I'm not being so specific. And as a lawyer, this is probably counterintuitive. And most of you are saying, well, wait, Brock, why are you not being specific as a lawyer? Here's why. Because the bulk of what I think you're gonna do from this forward, and if you haven't already been doing it, is shift your view to negotiations, shift your view to the business dynamics that surround this topic instead of how we define it. Because it's nice to get a phone call or an email or a web form populated that says, I need an interpolation license, I need a medley license, I need a mashup license. But if that doesn't happen, or even when it does, and then we see it and we're like, well, they said medley, but I think this is a mashup. At the end of the day, think about it. Do we care? And I'm not answering for you. There are publishers, there are administrators in the room will say, absolutely, we care because of the dynamics that apply to each. But as I walk through this, I feel like one of the things I can do for you is to give you different perspectives. It doesn't do any good for anybody if I'm just telling you what you already know. But creating a baseline, I think, is important. So let's jump from interpolations. We just talked about derivative works, because we're definitely going to need to talk a bit about that. So derivative works are where we have an original, we're creating something that kind of starts to feel new. It's not a new original work, it incorporates pieces of an old work, right? So that we have this thing that's somewhere beyond, it's not a miniature detail to where we say, you know, it's still a cover, but it's not enough to constitute an entirely new song or new copyright. So it's somewhere in between, right? So we just say, well, that sounds like a derivative work. Translations, adaptations, things like that are easy for us to say, well, that's a derivative work by definition. But where do we draw the line between a de minimis use, a de minimis change to a song like How He Loves, or, you know, Sloppy Wet Kiss, to something that we're like, man, that sounds like the same song, but there's different lyrics, maybe there's even a change in the melody. There's a spectrum, right? And so as we engage with this topic, we have to understand that sometimes when we're talking about mashups or medleys or covers or whatever, this is a much more intertwined conversation, which is why, again, I'm going to reinforce the idea that I'm not so concerned about definitions. So let me leave you with the final one. The final one is parody. And I'm going to use Seven Rings as an example, and I want this kind of just as a hanging thread out there. As we talk, I want you to just be thinking about parody. When we have a copyright like Favorite Things, right? We go back in history, that song was about simplicity. It was about the favorite things in life are the things that money can't buy, right? Then we have Ariana Grande, and I think just by way, just as a side note, I would have wanted to send out a link, but I really did like question, and as Andy and I talked about it, it was definitely not the right idea just for this group context. But you know, listen to Seven Rings and listen to the original. When I say original, it's think of Favorite Things, and listen to the lyrics. And then for all of you who are familiar with parody, think about Acuff versus Rose. How many of you are familiar just by case name Acuff versus Rose? Anybody? Right? Maybe 10%, 15% of you. How about if I say Pretty Woman and the Two Live Crew version versus the Roy Orbison version? You know, I'm guessing more hands will be raised. Why do I raise this issue? Why am I even talking about this? Because Seven Rings is this song that we think we attribute to Ariana Grande. But when we start listening to it, we're like, well, it's basically based on Favorite Things. So if we looked at our definitions, how many people would say Seven Rings is a cover of Favorite Things by show of hands? Anybody? So somebody's raising their hand where your placement, I can't tell who it is. Okay, now I see. Why do you think? Can you just say briefly why you think it's a cover?
Well, because it still conjures the image of the original work, and it just has the adaptation that it changed the lyric. So it's kind of up to the writers themselves or the publisher owner to make the call on whether they're going to say it's a cover recording or, yeah, we'll let it be a parody.
And this is great, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I think you raise a really great point, which is it's up to the publisher or the owner, whoever, the administrator. But that point is material to this entire conversation. Who decided it was or was not a cover? At the end of the day, we can look at this at Seven Rings versus Favorite Things and say, well, it's not a cover because too much has changed. Well, what's our basis for that? It's using the compulsory license language, which is no fundamental change or, you know, fundamental character change, right? You can't change the lyrics, can't change the melody, essentially, is what we're saying with a compulsory license. So we can say, you know, grossly, it doesn't constitute a cover because there were too many significant changes to the lyrics. And I think a musicologist would look at it and say, actually, there's a lot more changes than that, but just in a broad sense. I don't think it constitutes a cover, but I wanted to raise that issue because I think there's an argument that it is a cover. It's just over the line as a cover. But as we walk through these definitions, well, is it a medley? No, not really. You know, we're not having successive songs working. Go to a mashup. It's a different instrumental track layered with a different vocal track, right? We could say this is a mashup, right? And maybe that's the best way to define it. But as we go through this, okay, interpolation. We're re-recording parts of a melody of a song into your song. What is, maybe this is an interpolation, maybe because we're recording some of Favorite Things with some of Ariana Grande's Seven Rings, and suddenly this is really just, again, illustrating my point of why definitions help give context, but they don't answer these questions. So let me lay out a couple of, and actually I raised this because of parody, so let me finish with the parody piece. When we look at Pretty Woman, Roy Orbison's version, Two Live Crew's version, and if you're familiar with both versions, then you already know one is supposed to be viewed as kind of this wholesome, you know, and this is how the US Supreme Court viewed this in some respects, is Roy Orbison's describing this certain type of woman, Two Live Crew's describing a different type of woman, and the commentary on the original, the commentary even on the subject of the original, is a big piece of the transformative nature between those two songs, which is ultimately, after the US Supreme Court went through the fair use factors, why I think the court ended up saying this is a parody. So now I ask you, and I don't want you to answer this, I just want to challenge you as you walk away from this lunch, is why is Seven Rings not a parody? Its purpose and intent is to comment or criticize, maybe on the original. Favorite Things, money can't buy the simple things, the simple pleasures in life. Ariana Grande is talking about everything that her money does and can buy. And she wants it, she gets it, right? So we contrast that and you're like, perfectly lines up with the Two Live Crew Roy Orbison situation. Let's walk through these. The nature of the original. We can kind of fast forward because this is not a 101 group. So we can say, yeah, the original definitely has a lot of protection. I'm going to kind of fast forward through this piece, but for the same reason the US Supreme Court landed with the Acuff Rose case, we could say same kind of factors apply here. I'm going to skip the third factor, the amount and substantiality, and circle back to it. The effect on the market is the fourth fair use factor. The same analysis applies in my mind to the Acuff Rose case as would to Seven Rings. But let's backtrack to the amount and substantiality. One of the key factors the US Supreme Court used in the Acuff v. Rose case was that Two Live Crew just only used enough to conjure up the original. They didn't have it woven so deeply into their song that it really was a recast of the original. It was just enough so that when we heard Two Live Crew's version, we instantly thought Roy Orbison, Pretty Woman, but it wasn't enough to actually constitute like a mashup or an interpolation in that traditional sense. So if we're going to argue that Seven Rings is a parody, that's our critical issue, right? That's our make or break issue. If we're saying it's not a parody, simple argument is they've used too much. They've used more than is enough to communicate the idea. And there's plenty of case law out there on that topic. But I think it's critical that you understand that analysis, because as you're sitting there as administrators, as publishers, and requests are coming in, your instinct, my instinct, and this is not to point the finger at any of you, I'm saying all of our instinct is to fit something in a box and say, it's this, because I'm looking at it, these are the telltale signs, it fits in this box, so I'm going to treat it this way. And my challenge to you is to look at things and see the other perspectives. Because I think, and I get this as a lawyer, lawyers like to see black and white, but my answer to half questions I'm asked is yes and no, right? There's no black and white. I can say, how do you want me to argue this? Brock, can we win this case? Yes. Brock, will we lose this case? Yes. So we just make the argument. So my challenge to you is to start seeing things through all the different perspectives, take in the different biases, the creator's bias, the owner's bias, the industry bias, the legal bias, but also take these definitions and say, okay, this will help kind of guide what this may look like. But if I call one of you and I say, hey, I just wrote Seven Rings and I just want to make sure we're not going to get into a legal battle, but I think it's a parody, right? What is every single person in this room, I think, going to say? No, it's not. It's not a parody. Why would you say it? Because you're not motivated by giving away your content for free. right? You're not motivated by saying, I will waive a licensing fee in favor of your creativity in hopes that somehow that's going to come back to me. So quick side note on 7 Rings, and again, I want to use this as a thread throughout this topic. To my knowledge and my reading, 7 Rings is owned, the musical composition is owned 90% by Rodgers and Hammerstein's or their publisher administrator. I don't know actually who handles it, but 90% of that musical composition is not owned by Ariana Grande and her writing team. 10% is owned by Ariana Grande and her writing team. So this is a great segue, because how in the heck did we get from a song that maybe could have been used for free, right, because of a parody, maybe could have just been licensed as maybe an extended cover, maybe could have been called a mashup or an interpolation, and they just paid some sort of additional licensing fee. But instead, a new copyright emerges, and that copyright is owned 90% by who we're calling the original owners. And I think you're following me with what I mean by that, and 10% by the new owners, right? That's a crazy outcome, because I've done this a lot. I've done a lot of licensing. I'm sure every single one in this room has done a lot of licensing, and we would hope for some sort of what we would call an equitable split, right? Hey, you know what? There's an old song, there's a new song. Can we just split it 50-50? I mean, that feels safe. That feels good. And then the negotiations start. And we're like, yeah, but our song is the juice behind the success, right? So we should probably get 80%. And then the original says, no. I don't care if our song's been around for 20 years. That's why your song is important. I don't care who you are, what you're doing today. Our song's been around for 20 years, which means we're more important. So we want 80%. You get 20%. Thus, we're in the negotiations, right? So let's kind of switch gears. We've moved away from the biases. We were moving away from the definitions. Let's move into the practicality of how you engage with this topic. Okay, and I want to talk about the different components of these negotiations, because when a request comes in, if I'm assuming that everyone in this room well, actually, let me just get a quick read of the room. Is anyone in here a creator? Okay, so it looks like a handful. Let's call it 15%. But for the creators that raise your hand, are you here because you're an administrator, publisher, an owner, or is it because you're a creator? I don't know how the best to answer that. If you're here, if you're a creator and you're here because you're a creator only, raise your hand. Okay, so I see 2, 3 maybe. So everybody else, if you're a creator, you're here because you're also a publisher, owner, administrator, some capacity of that, right? Control. So we're here to talk about these techniques. And I do want to leave ample time for questions and answers, because I know I don't want to monologue. I don't think that's the best way to educate, but I certainly want to give you my perspectives and then transition into Q&A. So I'm going to leave a lot of time for Q&A, and just in case, Andy gave me a list of a lot of great questions in case anyone was shy or didn't want to jump in on the topic. So let's transition to negotiations. In negotiations, think about what you have in terms of power or leverage. And look, we're all Christians. We deal in Christian music all the time. A lot of times, many of us are connected to churches and church movements. So it's hard for us to view things through the lens of exploitation, leverage, right? But let's be real. I'm a transparent person. I love to be real. I don't like to hide behind Christian words. So I'm going to call it out what I see it. When it comes to copyrights and it comes to licensing and mashups and all this, we need to talk about leverage. We need to talk about positioning yourself. We need to talk about advances, fees, flat fees. We need to talk about points. We need to talk about new ownership, old ownership, exchanging ownership. We need to talk about scratching your back and I'll scratch my back, because as gross or as lame as that may sound, this is a part of the licensing business, as all of you would know instinctively. And so I want to talk about it in a very ethical way, but by way of a few examples. Historically, if you wanted to use a sample and that request comes in, many of you have actually done this, so you know this. Some of you have been doing this for 30, 40, 50 years. There may be, it's hard to get a visual, but no one looks like they're old enough to be doing it before I was born. But my guess is that there are people in here with years and years of experience. And so I don't want to pretend that you don't know what you're doing, because I know you know what you're doing. I'm just trying to add tools to the basket, okay? So anything that I say, please just add it to the toolkit. Don't take it as a personal challenge to anything you're doing right now. So let's talk about advances. If I wanted to sample a recording in 10 seconds of a recording into my recording right now, they can say no. Why can they say no? Let's regroup. Because what does a copyright mean? It means I have a limited monopoly on this content. What are my exclusive rights? Well, as for this topic, we're talking about copying. I can keep you from copying. I can keep you from creating a derivative work. I can keep you from distributing it for the first time. But we'll focus in on the derivative work and the copying part for now. So when you call in and say, hey, I want a license, or you email me, I want a license for sampling, I might say, okay, I'm going to charge you a rate per unit, per stream, per download, whatever it is. But think about it as a content owner. You have a place, and this is very common in hip hop genres, in funk genres, in soul genres, a lot of different genres. It's not so common in worship and gospel. There are elements of gospel where there may be, but certainly not in generic church worship, where we would even think, I'm going to charge you in advance. Now, the publishers that have been around for a while, the publishers that know the game, that's a very common first step. That's a first piece that they'll ask for. Let's talk about in advance, in addition to making sure that we get paid whatever we're going to get paid. But for all of you, you should be considering, should we charge in advance for this request? Because, hit pause on that. When I talk about leverage, what is your leverage as an owner/controller? Your leverage is, if I use your copyright without consent, I'm presumably infringing it. So your leverage is you can sue me. But how many of you, don't raise your hands, how many of you would sue me? You know, this is a part of our tension in this particular market of worship music, Christian music in general, is we all love each other. We're all brothers and sisters in Christ, but I will sue you if you use, I mean, imagine it, right? If that's your commentary. It's like the RIAA suing their customers, whenever 15 years ago, 10 years ago, for illegal downloads. That didn't turn out so well. I mean, some would argue, well, actually it did because it changed the tide. But from a PR perspective, that did not turn out so well. And the churches out there, thankfully, I'm not aware of any that are suing on the music side, but that have sued for other things like branding issues or whatever. They many times are retracting their statements. They're pulling back, they're dismissing their lawsuits. They're coming out publicly and saying, I'm sorry. So why am I bringing this up? Leverage. What is your leverage as an owner/controller? Somebody cannot use your copyright without consent, or else it's infringement. But if they know you're not going to sue them because you're a Christian or a Christian company, you lose a lot of leverage in that negotiation. And I know there are lawyers in the room. I'm assuming there are people with significant legal expertise in the room, significant copyright law expertise in the room that say, yeah, but Brock, the law is what the law is. But why did I kind of start this whole thing with, don't get stuck in the definitions. It all boils down to the negotiations. This whole field of discussion is about the negotiations. And in any negotiation, you want to negotiate from a smart position of leverage. Well, sometimes if you're dealing with a potential licensee that says in their mind, I know you're not going to sue me, or it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, or whatever those things are, you have to think as somebody who's controlling that copyright, whose job is to monetize that copyright. How can I actually extract value? How can I maximize value and enter into the licenses that I need to without making threats? Well, hey, if you do this, I'm going to sue you. Because now it obviously disrupts the relationship. It shifts the potential for future work together. The second you threaten somebody, that changes the game, right? So we don't want to threaten. Instead, we want to indirectly threaten. We want to have an underlying threat that's there that we sit on, and we know, well, just so this is a conversation, just so you know, I own the copyright, and I mean, what you're doing would be infringement unless you get permission. And the creator is saying, I'm bigger than you, or I'm hotter than any of your artists, or whatever their argument is. What are they doing? They're negotiating with you. And it's our instinct to kind of pull out that tool out of the bag that's just like, what you're doing is illegal, and the threat of a lawsuit is the only tool we have. Instead of thinking, in any negotiation, I mean, many of you may be married, I'm married, and My wife and I will negotiate, right? We don't call it negotiation. Hey, what do you want for dinner? There's a negotiation, right? And practically speaking, you think about these conversations, we view sort of from the top down. I'm the owner, I'm the administrator, I'm the controller. I tell you what the rules are. But remember biases. Creators don't care what your rules are. Consumers certainly don't care what your rules are. So the creator's coming at it thinking, okay, I need permission, in which case I'll give you whatever you're asking me for, as long as I can afford it, right? Which is great. If we're an administrator and we say, hey, here's the license fee, here's the percentage, here's what we want from you, and they say yes, where do I send the check? We're like, thank you, Jesus, right? That's the right move. But I would guess that for half of us, half the time, that's not what happens in the conversation. It's like, well, you know what? You asked, I'm asking for permission, but honestly, I think this should be a new copyright. In fact, I think we should own 90% of the new copyright. And you as an owner, administrator, are saying, whoa, 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 we're not giving up any ownership, which leads into, if you're not giving up ownership, are we creating a new copyright? And I know this is a significant piece that we're dealing with right now. So let me, and I'm sorry if I'm going down too many rabbit trails and I'm kind of being mindful of the time, but you understand, you guys deal with this all day. It's a complex topic. You cannot have this conversation without rabbit trails because now if somebody starts talking about, well, what if we register a new copyright? Again, who's making that negotiation? Who's taking that step forward? It's the requesting party typically. You as an owner aren't offering up ownership of something new, typically, right? You're coming at it like, I own something, I'm going to give you the right to use. They're coming to you saying, well, I want to use it, but actually I don't want to play by your rules. How about we play by my rules? And my rules are, there's a new copyright and I own 90% of that new copyright. Now, how many of us, don't show your hands, but how many of us would say, no, and it's a non-negotiable? If some of you, if any of you would raise your hand without any additional thought beyond that, no, it's not negotiable, we own it, we're not going to have this conversation, this is what we do. You know that there's certain publishers, certain owners that have enough. They have enough copyrights, they have enough substance, enough recognition, branding, name recognition and value where they can do whatever they want. But by and large, most publishers, most song owners and song controllers don't. And that's a reality of today. We know that without CCLI, we take a big hit as a genre of music, right? So we have to play a little bit safe in how we engage this conversation. And I'm trying to give you this particular tool is really a negotiation tool. When somebody's asking you for a license, and they're asking you for ownership or whatever they're asking you for, a reduction in the licensing rates, something less than you want to give. Part of what we have in our nature as owners and controllers is to impose rules, impose structure, impose guidelines for use, right? But think about it, where society is today is the rules don't apply to me. I can create music from my laptop from my cell phone. I don't need you, I don't need anybody. And yet they do, they're asking permission to use your content. But the mindset of the creator is very much, I don't play by the rules and I don't need your rules. So what happens to us when we impose one rule, 2 rules, 3 rules, and the creator is thinking, look, I'll use another song, I'll just use it without your permission, I will register this as a copyright without tagging yours or without giving any information. I mean, I see this as a lawyer all the time. Like, hey, there's actually a Capitol copyright in here. Well, it's not Capitol. I know you guys are in the Capitol building and I have friends in the room. I would obviously pick up the phone and say, hey, I saw this. But my point is that there are content creators who are trying to sneak through under the radar by registering new copyrights. And when they register with TuneCore, the distributors, whoever they're registering with, they're not listing your copyright. They're saying it's a new copyright. So unless Content ID somehow IDs it, unless there's an actual live person that hears this and says, wait a second, that's a lot like this copyright, and picks up the phone and knows who to call and raises enough of a stink, that's going to get unnoticed. And so now your copyright is out in the marketplace being used without your consent because why? You came on board saying we have 1, 2, 3 rules, and if you don't play by our rules, we don't play with you. And creators don't care about our rules, so they're going to find a way to play with or without you. So does this mean we cave to the creator? Does this mean we give them whatever they want? No. What this means is we broaden our perspective on negotiations. We broaden our perspective on, well, what can we extract if it's not a straight up license? What is there something else we can extract? If it's a well-known artist, we can extract publicity from that well-known artist. So we may not get money directly in the form of a license fee or an advance, but we may be able to line up one of our lesser known songwriters with their songwriter, or a lesser known, you know, if you have a label and a publisher connected, you may be able to place an artist with one of their artists. There's always something else on the table. And when I was in law school and we studied negotiations, one of the big things I remember is there's a table and there's 100 things on it. I'm paraphrasing, but there's 100 things on it. We tend to negotiate to 3 things: price, quantity, obligations. Kind of, I mean, of course we can name more, but I mean, we really simplify negotiations. What if there's 100 other things on that table? Publicity, marketing, collaborations, tour, you know, events that are already set up that we could send our people out onto, where we can extract value from that relationship that's not a direct license fee, but returns to us in multiples because we've thought outside the box. So I know this may not be, you know, I don't really know what everyone was expecting in terms of what are we going to get with this Lunch and Learn with Brock. I feel like one of the biggest pieces I can give to you, if I had to summarize it, would be I want you to start stepping out of the box. I want you to start thinking outside of the box in terms of negotiations. What can we extract that may not look like just a license fee or just an advance? Now we can get into, well, Brock, what are some best practices? And I'd probably like to transition pretty quickly into Q&A to get into some of that. But I feel like if there's anything I can leave with you as you're engaging with this topic, it would be this: learn to focus on the negotiations and not the rules. Learn to focus on the leverage and the value and the extraction of value and the use of leverage, instead of how do we define this and what's the proper rate for it. Because unless you're a machine that automates everything and you know just how to, you know, mechanical royalties are beautiful, right? 9.1 cents every time. But pretty much everything else is not a mechanical royalty. And that's where it's at. That's where creativity is at right now. Sync uses, mashup uses, sampling uses. Where does that leave us? Well, historically, we've always done it this way, Brock. We've always charged this rate. You know, we've always charged 12.5% for a print right. We've always charged, you know, 10 cents to 25 cents for a master license. Great. Keep doing that if that works for you. But I'm telling you, the market is moving away from you, because the market is creators and consumers. So the creators and consumers are saying, I want to play ball. Maybe I can't afford 25 cents per unit, per download, whatever. But here's what I can do. Listen to that, engage in that conversation. And this is going to be a complete shift for many, many organizations that have deep-seated practices. And I'm friends with a lot of the people in these positions where they would say, we just can't do it, Brock. Well, my challenge to you, if you're in a corporate environment where the rules are kind of working against you, is to say, are you allowed to have the conversation with the requesting party? And if the answer is yes, then get that conversation going. My guess would be, if you're an administrator and you're on staff at a corporate publisher, corporate administrator, where you may not have the authority, if you learn how to negotiate better, if you learn where your leverage is and is not, and where you can extract value that's beyond a license fee or an advance, my guess is if you can articulate that well and take that back to your supervisors, you now have a conversation that could change the tide for the entire organization. You may open up new income streams for your entire organization. And I'll end with this. I'm a big fan of Seth Godin, The Linchpin. If you haven't read this, you know, and you're in a corporate environment, even if you're not, I suggest reading it. But if you're in a corporate environment, read that and then view your licensing activities as a linchpin to the organization. So I'm going to stop because I want to give ample time for Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Andy to kind of help moderate.
Well, I'm just going to pull up the list of questions because there were a lot of really good ones once my page loads. Okay. Honestly, well, I'm going to start with this one because I know it's a big issue and I'm dealing with this right now and I'm asking the questions. When you deal with Medleys that are going to be released to the digital space, and only one of those copyrights is going to be paid because Harry Fox and Music Reports can only track one composition. They can't work with medleys or 2 or 3 songs like YouTube can, but they can't. So what would be best practices for dealing with a situation like that where you want all parties to benefit from all those digital revenue streams?
In my mind, I know this may not sound like the cleanest legal answer, but the law isn't always clean as we would hope. I think it's impossible unless you register a new copyright. But here's the issue: if you register a new copyright, it's a derivative work, right? I mean, you're almost always going to have to register it as a derivative work. But think about what's protected in a derivative work. It's only the new components, right? So if we register a medley or a mashup or interpolation for that matter, it's only protecting the new elements. So we have songs that have existed for 5 years, let's say, but now we put together a medley in 2019 and we register that new copyright. Well, it doesn't, obviously we all know, it doesn't extend the copyright life of any of the underlying musical compositions, right? But we have a new sound recording, so there's a new copyright. We now have a new compilation, so we can register that as a compilation and say there's a new copyright. Well, what could we sue for if there's a violation? That's arguable, but you can sue for the actual arrangement of the compilation, the order of songs, because that is what the compilation is. Each individual song owner could also sue for infringement if the compilation, if the medley was infringed and their portion was the piece that was infringed. The individual song owner could sue, but I do think when you think about why does Spotify get sued for using songs that aren't licensed, here's the reality: because it's nearly impossible to make sure that every single song on your platform is properly licensed. So the answer is, I think we're in a state right now where some of this is actually physically impossible without bootstrapping, without a little bit of electrical tape to kind of tape the edges together. So this is not legal advice. I mean, I think each of you probably work with an attorney, but I think you have to view it through the lens of maybe we register a new copyright, understanding that there are limits to that new copyright. But now when we submit it for tracking purposes, it's almost like historically if we had 4 songwriters. Well, that's no problem. 1 copyright, 4 songwriters, they each get paid appropriately. The difference here is 4 copyrights that are wrapped up in a compilation. So it would work out the same way, but it's a single copyright that's registered with the platform, whoever it is, or the Copyright Office, so that we know exactly who to pay. And then the agreement actually of how the payment gets doled out would be a function of negotiations between the owners. Does that make sense?
It does. Anybody have any questions related to that? All right, another question. Can we address what to do, how to classify it when an artist creates spontaneous worship, utilizes an existing song copyright, especially when it's a song we don't own?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, and I would say in the worship context, the church music context, this is the it issue, right? Spontaneous. Spontaneous, as we all know, tends to work off of you. If you're leading a song, Good Father, you're leading Good Father, Reckless Love, whatever it is, and then you start into that the adding new lyrics, right? From a technical perspective, let's just call it new lyrics. You're adding new lyrics onto an existing song. So that starts to look, let's look at our definitions. Well, that starts to sound a lot like maybe an interpolation, possibly. Like, again, we can go to the definitions. It starts to look like one of those. But here's the real issue. In the performance context, if let's say that CCLI applies to the song, if it's Good Father, right? So the performance is cleared. And then we're kind of going into a spontaneous moment. We can say, well, does it change the fundamental nature? We kind of make those compulsory license types of arguments, but no one said we've created a new copyright yet, because remember, copyright subsists in works fixed in a tangible medium of expression from which they can be perceived, right? So the performance itself so far, now this is without regards to any anti-bootlegging laws, so let's not go off target on that. But the performance so far feels good, right? We all feel like, hey, as long as the outer songs in between or on the outskirts of the spontaneous piece are registered with CCLI and somebody's getting paid on those, we feel safe with it. But now it's streamed. Now it's recorded. What are we going to do? Well, I'll tell you right now, a lot of churches, because the spontaneous is originating from church performances typically, right? It's not always in concert format. It's in church performance context or church events, church conferences or whatever. So now they say, well, we recorded that, we captured that, we streamed that, we want to do something with it. Same answer as every other question for licensing. They're going to have to call up and say, look, I used your song and I added a spontaneous moment. Unless, you know, remember on CD, you would have track 1, track 2, track 3. Well, MP3s, we have an MP3 that's intact, separate from the next MP3. We can hear a defined split between song 1, song 2, song 3, right? With spontaneous, it starts to feel like a medley, except even a spontaneous song, a 10-minute spontaneous song ends at some point. Now, unless you're Upper Room, and I can talk about some of these because they're my clients. Upper Room, 50-minute, spontaneous song. All that spun together, we may have actually 20 songs that are separately identifiable within that 50 minutes, right? So what happens on a very practical level, somebody needs to pick up the phone or send an email and say, hey, we need to work something out. Do we come up with a new copyright? Maybe that's the answer. Do we pay you a license fee? Well, we have 20 songs in our spontaneous. Do we need to pay 20 different mechanicals? I mean, think about it. Medleys back in the day, I remember at Vineyard Music, 1995, hey, we got a medley. We want to use 3 songs. Okay, well, we're not going to charge them triple mechanical, right? So maybe we'll do a third mechanical. Like it feels like equitable. It feels fair. But I remember doing deals that were double mechanical. So now you think about, no one wants to pay mechanical in the first place. I mean, I'm not talking about us, but outside of this, So now the issue becomes, if you have a spontaneous song, and especially one that's more than one song, no one's going to want to pay 3 times, 5 times mechanical. So what's going to end up happening is you're going to have to have a negotiation. Think about it. The church is thinking, but we didn't. It's not actually the original composition. They think the spontaneous is a new composition, right? I'm guessing that everyone in this room that's dealt with spontaneous, if they're talking to a church or worship leader, the church or the worship leader is coming at this like, no, we actually wrote a new song. And you're, from the copyright angle, from the owner angle, saying, no. That, first of all, that's not how it works legally. Second of all, practically speaking, that's not what happened. All you did was say some prayers, some verses, some Bible verses or other lyrics over the top of our pre-existing copyright. That's infringement. I mean, we need to get that in our head. Spontaneous songs are infringement without consent. But we don't want to just say yes or no. We want to look at what's on the table. So I know it's a long-winded answer, Andy, but I think with spontaneous, if we want to give definition to it, we can line it up with interpolations, medleys, depending on how the spontaneous works. But we can line it up with one of those definitions. But I really feel from a licensing perspective and from an ownership perspective, I think we need to start being in the mindset of, do we consider a new copyright right now? Do we consider, if they're asking us for permission to add that spontaneous moment, do we say, sure, but it's like the 7 ring scenario. We own 90% of that new composition. You own 10%. And here's what's going to happen. Yeah, but it's that spontaneous moment. God showed up. And I'm not joking. I've been a Christian since 0. I love Jesus, and I'm not joking around when it comes to my Christianity, but I am joking around when I say it's going to be spiritualized. Oh, but God's on it. It's not really, God's gave us something new. I'm not saying God didn't give him something new, but from a legal perspective, and we know the Bible says, obey the laws of the land, it's infringement without consent. You can't add lyrics. You can't add verses. You can't change the fundamental character of a song without consent, unless fair use, one of the exemptions applies. So I think that's the answer right there, is you look at it and you help educate the church or the worship leader, because they're not necessarily going to have perspective on this. They're definitely not going to have legal understanding. And you have to walk through, but I think this may be a time where if it's Upper Room doing a 50-minute worship set and you're like, they got 1 million views, maybe we need to play ball. I think that's the conversation you need to have in your head, is maybe we need to play ball. Maybe we do need to come up with a new copyright, and it's a 50-minute 50 song that we're paying 20, 70 people on. That may be the right answer.
Are there any other questions from this group? I keep going all day.
Brock, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Question, the sequential nature of medleys, is that anywhere defined that if it's songs in order, that means it's a medley versus songs going back and forth, it means it's not? Is there something that you've heard of about sequential?
I have. I mean, throughout my career, I mean, some of this stuff, you know, you kind of pick up, just you don't know where you got it. But yeah, I think there may even be case law defining medley as like a succession. And I think I'm not so much arguing with that. And I would agree. I think if you ask me, Brock, was Kelly Clarkson's a medley or something else? I'd say absolutely it's a medley. Is Seven Rings a medley? Absolutely not. I can give you a lot of examples. Oh, and by the way, one of the links that you sent out, and I really like you to listen to it. Some of the visuals, like, use your discretion. Obviously, you're all adults, but there's a song by Madonna, Material Girl. There's a song by Poppy. I don't know, Andy, if you remember the name of the song, but it's we can get the link out. But anyways, you hear Material Girl. I mean, if you listen to it, you're like, what in the world? This is Material Girl, but it's Poppy 2019. And I can't tell because it's really bright back there. Is that Kent that just asked the question?
Yes.
You can either confirm or deny.
Hey, Kent. I would say yes, but can I point to a specific case or part of the Copyright Act? Honestly, to my memory, I don't remember the Copyright Act defining a medley. Now, there may be Copyright Office circulars that define a medley as that versus something else. But yeah, I would say from an industry perspective, and you know, the law often follows industry practices. So I would say if we want to kind of get on the same page in the room, medley tends to be succession of songs. If it's not a succession of songs, it's not a medley. That's my perspective.
I think we might have a question from some of our virtual, but while we're waiting on one of those, anyone else in the audience have a question?
Hey, Brock, Jeremy Castro here.
Jeremy, hey.
I'm not sure if this is a question or I need therapy. So I won't name the artist, of course, but I'm currently in a situation where an artist has recorded a song that they mostly wrote. Maybe about 5 lines in the song, they borrowed from another song that is owned by two others. And so the situation is the artist who recorded the song ironically wants a piece of the song. Basically there's two copyright owners that really own the song, basically. Let me clarify that own the song. But because he has recorded the song, he wants ownership, a piece of ownership. And I'm trying to explain to artists that's a little weird that somebody else's song and you want a piece. So I know that happens often in music as a whole. I guess the question is, how do you navigate? It's sticky. It's sticky. How do you, I guess, navigate those kind of sticky situations where they don't own the song but they want it?
Right. I think the first answer, I think you brought up therapy. That therapy is probably your answer. Just kidding. I think we all need a little bit of that. Here's my thing, Jeremy, is I think our instinct again is to be like, but that's not how it works, right? Let me tell you how it's supposed to work. And the artist is glazed over. Like, I don't care how it's supposed to work. I'm asking for something that's crazy, right? And you're thinking that's crazy. You didn't write it. And I mean, we've all seen this. There are producers that aren't really songwriting, but because they were doing something that related to the recording that kind of translated, they say, well, I'm a songwriter now. I want 10% of the musical composition. We can give dozens and dozens, thousands and thousands collectively of our situations like this. Here's point blank what I would recommend. step back from the emotions of it, step back from the craziness of the request and say, would this make sense to propel the song forward? Would this make sense to bring more eyeballs and more ears to this song, this recording, which, you know, because you're really dealing with both parts, I think, to some respect. And, you know, what if you went back to the artist and said, you know, obviously we wouldn't normally do this, but we're willing to, but here's what we want from you. And you think about, is there something that artist, I almost joke because just thinking of songwriters that I work with that would do something like that, or artists that I work with that would do something like that, and I love, but for all I know, it was one of them, so I'm not even going to joke about it. My point is that you can play hardball, Jeremy. You could say, it doesn't work that way, and what you've done without my consent violates the law, so here's how it's going to work. And I see publishers and administrators do that all the time. And I can't get mad at them. It's like, you know what, you're playing by the rules, and the rules are this. I think what I've grown in my own professional life, I really have grown to appreciate negotiations. I've really grown to appreciate trying to think outside the box. And the reason why is because I don't believe in the zero-sum game. Now, that's hard to tell a corporation, you know, there's not a zero-sum game. I believe everybody can win. I truly believe that to my core. And I'm saying that to you in response because I think if you can look at this situation and say, what the artist asked for doesn't make sense, but here's how it could make sense. Change the narrative a bit in a way where it could make sense. And if you can't find a way for it to make sense, then your answer is no. We're not going to do that. And if they say, well, you know, I already got the song out there, then we'll issue a takedown. And I know that sounds like a jerk, right? I mean, imagine lawyers get, I think, the brunt of it because our clients many times are telling us, you send out the cease and desist. I don't even care anymore. I'm always the jerk. But you know what? That's okay. And sometimes there has to be the jerk. That's fine. But the law is what the law is. So Jeremy, my answer really is, if you feel like you can leverage this into something meaningful and gain and extract a good, healthy fee or more exposure to a song, then by all means, talk the game with this guy, this person. I don't know if it's a guy or a girl. But if not, if you look at this and you're like, all we do is lose. Every way I slice this, we lose. So no, I'm not going to play this game. Then you have to play hardball and you have to say, I'm sorry, we can't, we're not willing. And I know Andy had on the list of questions, what do you do when you have sort of a belligerent, you know, unwilling to negotiate person? I'll answer that at the same time. You have to decide. I don't like bluffs. I mean, you know, I'm showing my cards, by the way. I'm not a big bluffer. And by big, I mean, I don't bluff. I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. So when you deal with me as an attorney, I'm not going to be bluffing. That doesn't mean I'm going to tell you all my secrets, but I'm not going to bluff you. So if I say, hey, you're going to get sued, that means I've cleared with my client that we have the authority to sue. Those words aren't going to come out of my mouth unless my clients authorize me. So for you, I would say think long and hard. Would you threaten to sue them? Because if it's a bluff and they call your bluff, you're done. They'll never engage in an honest negotiation with you again because they're always going to know you just bluff. And all they have to do, it's like a kid, can I have candy? Can I have candy? No, no, no. Can I have candy? Fine, after 48 times, which is my kids. And then I give it to them. So next time it's 46. Next time, now it's like one time. Sure, go ahead. But you get the point, right? I think that's the way to deal with this situation.
All right, we've got a question from one of our virtual guests, Jonathan Bryce, who actually is with Gateway Publishing.
Yeah.
They're sponsoring. How do you or have you dealt with creatives in our CCM industry / worship space using mainstream material in this way with particular interest in parody and fair use?
Yeah, great. I think that we as a group here, church music publishers, the church market, worship, gospel, and all that, I do think we play by a different set of rules, and I think ours is more relational. I think ours is more driven by us than it is about money. And I'm not saying everyone in this room wants and needs to make money, but I do think we play by a little bit of a different set of rules. But when you're dealing with the world out there, general market, secular, you have to go into that conversation knowing that it's a cage match. I mean, they're out for blood, and I mean that in the most respectful way. I just mean that in an honest way. So I think engaging with the outside world, you're going to have to up your game of maybe we do need to threat. And I'm definitely not going to name, anybody, but I've had to do that for my church-based, worship movement type clients where I'm up against a secular owner and I have to make threats, but I don't make them unless I know I can, but I make them. And I have a straight face and I do what I need to do to negotiate. But I think when there's, Kent and I have had great conversations about this stuff. And I know, I've fumbled and Kent's been like, Brock, we'll work it out. And I'm so grateful for that. But if Kent wasn't Kent and we weren't friends, that conversation would not be happening with a general market controller. So I do think from the general market perspective, we have to change our hat and realize this is business. It's not emotional. It's not about us getting hurt. It's not about us, well, they should give. And we're so used to that in the church sometimes. We should give. It should be, equitable. The world doesn't care about equity. The world is a zero-sum game. So we have to put on that mindset that this is where it's coming from. But to parodies and fair use, Seven Rings is a perfect example. Let's circle back to that. If I wanted to engage with Rodgers and Hammerstein, or again, I don't know who administrates the catalog, but you know what I mean by that. I might come out of the gate saying, here's my full legal brief. It's 100 pages long of why this is a parody and I don't need your consent. Of course they're going to say it's not a parody. Absolutely. I mean, who in this room would say, yeah, I think you're right. I don't want your money, right? They're going to say, no, it's not. And thus the battle ensues. So I think if you know, but remember, a license is consent from the owner or the controlling party. Parodies, fair use, that is a defense to infringement. So that doesn't mean you won't wind up in court. It just means that you have an argument to make, and hopefully it's a strong one, right? And I've written a lot on that. I love the topics of fair use and parody, but when there's a risk, I mean, the reality is you may lose that case because the judge just doesn't align with your argument.
Brock, thank you so much for your time today. Everyone, I'm going to send out the links that Brock was talking about. I'll send out the recording so you can go back and watch it. And if anyone has any questions in the meantime, you can email me or info@administrators of gospel music, and we'll try to get your questions facilitated. But Brock, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye, everybody.